It's Saturday, October 5th, 2024, and we are officially 1 month away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini episode. I'm Grant Herms. Today in the show, we're doing a check-in on the race by the numbers. So we're talking about the latest polling numbers, where things stand nationally, where they stand in the swing states, how much money has been raised, how much money is left, and where that money is going. Let's start with the polls here. The most recent poll out is from PBS and Marist College, a really highly rated pollster. And as always with polling here, a caveat, polls are snapshots in time that are good for taking the temperature of the race, but they're not really good predictors of the weather of the overall election. All right. So that new poll has Harris up 2 points among national voters, 50 to 48, which means she has a majority of the vote. And if it stays that way, she'll actually be 2 points under what Biden's victory in 2020 was. Also, just because I was curious, I looked up how many presidents have actually won the popular vote, and honestly, it made me feel a little bit better. So 41 out of 46 presidents have won the popular vote when they ran a campaign. So I'm not talking about vice presidents who came into office after a resignation or after a death. That means just 5 presidents lost the popular vote, but still won. 3 of them were in the 1800s, with the last one being the election of 1876, which was a really contentious election. Actually, it was one of the first ones that was challenged. It's how we got a lot of the challenges in 2020. I'm not going to go into all of that. But the most recent 2 were after a 124-year drought where presidents won the popular vote and the Electoral College. The first one was in 2000 with George W. Bush, where the Supreme Court stepped in and ruled that Bush had won the presidency. And then, of course, in 2016 with Donald Trump, where Hillary Clinton got 2.8 million more votes, but still lost the election. Honestly, I'm not really sure what that tells us. I just thought it was nice, and it kind of felt like coming up for air a little bit when so much of the conversation is around the Electoral College and paths to victory. But it also felt nice to remember that the national vote is still a good measure of democracy. Okay, so when we dig down into some of these numbers on the polling demographics, we're starting to see some splits and some things solidify with just 30 days out. Trump is leading by 8 points with white voters, and Harris is up 21 points with non-white voters, which is a pretty meaningful difference given that so many of the swing states are more diverse. Think Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, even Michigan. Trump is leading by 8 points with white voters, and with non-white voters, Harris is up 21 points with about 60% of the vote. That's a pretty meaningful difference between her and Trump, given that so many of the swing states are so diverse. Think Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, and you can even throw Michigan in there too. But when it does come to those voters, Harris is behind Biden's victory with them by about 11 points. Biden carried non-white voters with 71% of the vote, so she has some work to do. And now the reason I keep pointing out Harris compared to Biden is because while it doesn't always mean people are switching parties or candidates, it's just a good way to talk about confidence and where voters' minds are at right now compared to where they were 4 years ago. And speaking of those people who might be on the fence, independents are 4 points more likely to vote for Trump than Harris, 50 to 46, which is a problem for the Harris campaign, which has really been trying to reach those middle voters, and whose campaign has been using groups like Republicans for Harris, or Harris even made a trip to Ripon, Wisconsin, which is seen as the birthplace of the Republican Party, although I think Jackson, Michigan would like to have some words about that. But Harris had a rally there and was joined by former Republican Representative Liz Cheney, which is something you just do not see in elections, having former members of the opposite party stumping for you as a candidate. And then there were 2 really staggering divides in this poll. The first is the gender gap. And what I mean by that is the difference between men and women voting for each candidate. It tells us a lot about how far apart men and women are when it comes to ideology. This year, at least in this poll, it is a massive 34% difference, with Trump winning 57% of men compared to 41% for Harris. And among women, Harris is up 58% to Trump's 40%. And then to get the gender gap, you take the difference of both those numbers and then you add those differences together. That gets us to 34. Now that gap is absolutely wild because it's almost 3 times bigger than that gap in 2020 and 2016. The gender gap was 12 points, with Biden getting a 15-point bump with women in 2020. In 2016, that gender gap was only 11 points with Hillary Clinton in the race. And not that women have to vote for a woman, it just tends to be more likely. And also, these numbers that I'm talking about here are exit polls, and the PBS poll I'm talking about isn't an exit poll, so it's not exactly apples to apples, but it is a little more like Red Delicious to Granny Smith, if you get what I'm saying. In elections before our last two presidential elections, going back to about 1980, that gap has hovered around that 10-point split. And in the last 30 years or so, it's largely shaken out that women have voted for the Democratic candidate more consistently, while men have broken for the Republican, apart from a few elections like Obama in 2008. But to have that split be 3 times bigger than what we've seen in the past is wild. And really, fellas, men out there, are we okay? Are we good? Because, my dudes, it's 2024. Not that you got to vote for Harris, but what's going on here? And honestly, this is a call to any gender and politics expert out there. If you know what's happening, please DM me, because I do not know. I have ideas, but I don't actually know. Okay, let's talk about the other stunning number in this poll. We are talking about the generational divides, and it's not what you think. So Harris has a 53% majority with Gen Z and millennials. No surprise there. She also has a 53% majority with baby boomers and a 52% majority of the silent/greatest generation. Because there's so few of them, they get kind of lumped together. And that's a huge switch, because in the past, boomers and the older generation above them have definitely gone for Trump. On the flip side, Trump is winning with 53% of Gen X. It's the only generation he's winning right now, and it's something that we've seen throughout his election. A really great piece from Politico back in May points out that Gen X grew up in the Cold War, came up in the Reagan mania of the 1980s, so they started further to the right than most other generations, and now, as many of them are in their 50s or approaching their 60s, a lot of them are just now starting to hit that level of generational wealth or retirement, the what's in it for me age of politics, and that part of Donald Trump is appealing to them. Also, as a generation, they sort of have this knee-jerk, faux, counterculture, middle child syndrome kind of thing going on, where anything mainstream is selling out to them, and they're going to just reactionarily push against it. And in this case, the mainstream, every other generation, voting for Harris, so Gen X going the other direction. Okay, let's get into some of the swing states. Every one of these states in the polls are about 1 or 2 points apart. Harris is up in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and given the past few months of polling, it looks like that's her blue wall. She's also up in Nevada right now, which is new. Now, with those 4 states, her path to the White House is pretty much locked up. She could actually lose Nevada and just keep those other 3 states and still win. Trump is up in the other swing states, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and like I said, he needs to peel off one of those Midwestern states. Nevada wouldn't do it. There just aren't enough electoral college votes there to win the race. And that brings us to the money. The Harris campaign has been raising money hand over fist. In the latest filing, which was for August, and it was also Harris's first full month as a candidate, which I know is wild to think about. But in that amount of time, Harris raised $190 million, $60 million more than the entire Republican Party, and the entire Democratic Party outraised Republicans 3-1, which is just an insane amount of money. And while money isn't exactly a mark of who wins an election, it's a pretty good predictor. In congressional and Senate races going back to 2000, the candidate who spent the most money won the majority of the time, and none of those odds dipped below a 71% chance. And most recently, in 2022, in the House, you won your race 92% of the time. Now, the presidency shakes out a little differently, with just 3 out of the last 6 presidential elections where spending predicted the winner. But a lot of that also has to do with other factors when people vote for a presidency, like ongoing wars or the incumbency advantage for presidents, where people just tend to vote for the sitting president because they're already president. But in this race, all that money that I just talked about is getting spent. And it's getting spent on ads and rallies in swing states. When it comes to the ads, which is where the bulk of this money goes, you can see that the Harris campaign is outspending Trump's campaign in every single swing state and has plans to outspend them until the election. Those ad buys are already placed. The part that I find interesting is where that money is going. The Trump team has all but given up on spending in Nevada and Michigan, given the difference between the campaigns. Trump is spending $6 million in Nevada to Harris's 18, and he's spending $26 million in Michigan to Harris's 46. Trump has also fallen behind in spending in Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Wisconsin from about $8 to $3 million, depending on which state you're looking at. Some of that could be that the Trump team just has confidence in the Sun Belt states turning out to vote for him and knowing that he'd have to take out one of those blue wall states, and the only one really left to go for is Pennsylvania, where both campaigns are putting a lot of eggs into one very small basket. In the last 30 days, they're spending about the same amount of money here. Harris has $63 million, Trump at $62 million, and it's clear that Trump is going to try to make some sort of play for Pennsylvania in the next 4 weeks, including today, where Trump is back in Butler. That's the same place where the first assassination attempt happened, and that was just 12 weeks ago. But that will be tomorrow's episode. Finally, there are a few curveballs to watch for here in the next month. First, whatever might happen in the Trump D.C. case from special counsel Jack Smith, if that D.C. judge makes some sort of ruling that puts the charges and January 6th back in the news and puts it top of mind for voters, that could be a big deal and could change some sentiments for those last-minute voters, which is an awful lot of people. Second, and I think more importantly, what happens with the recovery from Helene? As rescues continue, whole sections of Georgia and North Carolina have been wiped out, which will eat up into Trump's lead in those key swing states there, though not to minimize this absolute tragedy down to just cold electoral political math. I don't want to do that either. And because of that, it will also matter how the Biden administration continues to respond to rescue and recovery efforts, because that will have some sort of reflection on Harris and maybe some sort of glancing blow on an alternative that would have been a Trump presidency. So it'll be interesting to see how voters react to the response and then how they take that idea of the response and put that on the election. Okay, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Thank you so much for listening. I know this was sort of a weedsy one today, but please follow, rate, and review this show on whatever podcast app you've got, because I've only got 30 days left of these minis, and they're going to come fast. That also means you can like and subscribe on YouTube and subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got the extended interview with yesterday's guest, Tina Barden, our elections expert, to talk all about election security. It's a great conversation. There was a lot that I had to cut out to fit it into the main show yesterday, so go ahead and subscribe there to the Make It Make Sense Substack and check out that interview plus the other content I've got there. And then, as always, you can share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.